this time. All right, let's go ahead and get ready to get started. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming out for today's seminar series. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. David Chestnut here from the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. So David has a master's degree from here at USC, and he's overseeing the statewide ambient surface water quality monitoring program since 1985. So that's his time at DHEC started in 1985. So he's been there almost 39 years. You said in a couple of days, basically February the 5th, you'll be there 39 years, right? So he's seen a lot of changes probably at DHEC over the number of years. All right, so in 1989, he was the principal developer of the South Carolina Estuarine and Coastal Assessment Program. And then he's also was a driving force in the creation of the South Carolina Harmful Algal Bloom Network Advisory Group, and also the South Carolina Adopt a Stream Citizen Science Monitoring Program. So today, Mr. Chestnut is going to talk to us about his experience with the Clean Water Act and looking at 50 years of the Clean Water Act. All right, with that.
All right, thanks. And this presentation was part of a celebration that the Bureau of Water put on to mark the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Clean Water Act. And there was another speaker that was on there who has been working for DHEC and its predecessor for 60 years. So I only have 39. So I'm still kind of the youngster. I've taken some things from his presentation and some other introductory stuff to kind of cover a little bit of the historical background of things. And you're going to hear, I'm going to be promoting a lot of what I've done because that's what the boss was wanting me to look at is what are some of the other things that the Bureau of Water has contributed to outside of the very basic monitoring and permitting and enforcement kind of activities that everybody thinks of. So these are some really important historical milestones from a federal perspective. In 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was enacted, and it was the first major U.S. law to address water pollution. In 1962, Rachel Carlson's book, Silent Spring, was released, which really focused on the impacts of DDT and the impacts it was having in the environment and on the birds of prey. In 1970, there was a huge oil spill in Santa Barbara. The Cuyahoga River, caught fire just about every year since 1953, but there was a big fire in 1970. And some of those things kind of got the citizens and environmental concerns motivated to try to get something more done. And so that led to the first Earth Day in 1970. And so that was an important year for the modern environmental movement. Almost 20 million people participated in that first Earth Day. Also in 1970, President Nixon created a council to consider how to organize federal government programs designed to reduce pollution so that those programs could more efficiently address the goals that he had laid out in a 37-point message that he delivered. And also in 1970, following the recommendations of that council that he put together, the president sent to Congress a plan to consolidate many of the environmental responsibilities of different federal agencies into one new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, to permit better response to environmental problems. And that was also the year that NOAA was created to essentially focus on the ocean and coastal aspects as well.
Can we minimize that little box over here, just so it's not blocking some of your slides? Should be, you're in this corner, there should be a. Yeah, that's just out of your way.
All right. But it's kind of interesting to note that EPA was created before the Clean Water Act was actually enacted and passed. So EPA was around for a couple of years before what became known as the Clean Water Act was actually signed. So, in 1952, the Cuyahoga River, it used to catch on fire fairly frequently, which is kind of odd for water to burn. That's not really something you would expect. Another part of some of the goals of that Clean Water Act was to make all U.S. waters fishable and swimmable by 1983. Have we got there? To have zero water pollution discharge to waters of the nation by 1985. To prohibit the discharge of toxic amounts of toxic pollutants, to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Very noble goals. But back in the 70s, those smoke-filled rooms, it was not cigars necessarily that they were smoking when they were developing these goals. So the reality of what they could accomplish wasn't necessarily at the forefront of the discussion. I shut something that I probably shouldn't have. All right, now we're in trouble. In the early 70s, 2/3 of the nation's lakes, rivers, and coastal waters were unsafe for fishing or swimming, and untreated sewage was dumped into open water. So some of the goals of the EPA before the enactment of the Clean Water Act was to do research on important pollutants, on the impact of those pollutants on the environment. And keep that one in mind, because that's going to be a lot of what I talk about today, is some of the work that EPA has done in that regard. And to work alone or in cooperation with other agencies to monitor the condition of the environment, biological as well as physical, establish quantitative environmental baselines to adequately measure the success or failure of pollution control activities, and in concert with states set and enforce standards for air and water quality for individual pollutants, establish the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permitting for industries, assuring consistent standards covering the quality of the wastewater that was discharged, and allowed permittees to look to the states to support their efforts with both financial and technical assistance. Now, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972 is what's commonly referred to as the Clean Water Act. And it established the basic structure for regulating the discharge of pollutants into the waters of the United States and regulating water quality standards for surface waters. And there's been a couple rounds of major changes to that act in 1977 and 1987. There's been some updates. We could probably use another round of updates. But from South Carolina's perspective, in 1950, the South Carolina Pollution Control Act was passed, and it established the South Carolina Water Pollution Control Authority within the state health department. Now, remember, 1948 was when the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed. So South Carolina was kind of paying attention to what was going on in Washington. So we were kind of, following the example, what the national level discussion was about. In 1970, the South Carolina Pollution Control Act of 1970 established the South Carolina Water Pollution Control Authority as an independent state agency. And remember, in 1970 was the first Earth Day. That's when Nixon put together his council and EPA was established. So again, we were kind of keeping our eye on what was happening at the federal level. And in 1971, the Water Pollution Control Authority was merged with the State Board of Health, and the result was DHEC, as we have it today, and which may not live that way very much longer. So with the passing of the Clean Water Act and the implementation of the NPDES process of issuing permits to control the quality of wastewater discharge from both industries and municipalities, domestic sewage and industrial waste, it was directly focused on those end of pipes. What's coming out of the pipe from these different treatment activities, different industrial activities, and what they were discharging to the receiving waters. And it really improved the receiving stream water quality. So now our remaining challenge are more non-point source pollution and stormwater runoff that really, they don't come out of the end of a pipe. It's really hard to put control on. Some of it's overland flow. Some of it's what runs into ditches and discharges directly to streams with no treatment of any kind. So these are kind of the biggest problems still facing us today. And now there are contaminants of emerging concern that are out there that people are beginning to talk about and getting more attention. Things like pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors, personal care products. Many of these things, like pharmaceuticals and even some personal care products, they're designed to have impacts on the human body. But what happens when they pass through the human body and get discharged into the waters of the state? And that's where endocrine disruptors have caused impacts to the sexual, gender situation of different fish and amphibian species, where things are not necessarily coming out and remaining male or female the way they were initially born. It's changing the way that the systems of some of the aquatic animals are acting. So we got to remember that what works on our bodies oftentimes has impacts on animal systems as well. So those are some things that are now becoming a big focus. And in a similar vein, you'll hear me talk about this, touch on it a little bit more, but pesticides in particular, they're meant to kill things. And if they're not applied properly and they end up in our waters, they're going to kill other things than what they were intended for. But what is some of the permitting done in terms of overall water quality? We're looking at biochemical oxygen demand concentrations versus dissolved oxygen. This is in just all of the stream sites that we've sampled in South Carolina, and it goes all the way back to the 50s, some of our earlier data, before there were permits, before there were any sorts of controls on what was being discharged to the streams and rivers of South Carolina. Biochemical oxygen demand is a measure of how much oxygen is consumed to break down the organic matter that's in the water column. And when you're discharging raw sewage, there's a lot of organic matter there, whether it's carbonaceous organic matter or nitrogenous organic matter. It sucks up oxygen out of the water as it decomposes, and that can result in fish kills. And it can really impact what sort of macroinvertebrate species you find in these streams. So that was one of the first things that was really a target on the permits as they were being issued, was to reduce that biochemical oxygen demand to improve the dissolved oxygen characteristics of the waters of the state. And so you can see over time, BOD was not being controlled at all prior to the NPDES permit program going into place. But you can see as permits began to be issued in the early 70s, dissolved oxygen conditions across the state improved. This little dip, that's just a blank spot in the database. Doesn't mean that was actually zero BOD. It was just there's a gap in the data back then. And these extremely high peaks, we weren't doing as much monitoring back in the 50s and 60s as we do today. So a few of those extreme situations that were investigated, because a lot of that early focus was on where maybe there were fish kills occurring and things like that. So some of those are extreme, but it gives you a general idea of some of the impact of the permitting process. Something else in a similar vein, this is total phosphorus. Phosphorus is an element that's essential for sustaining life, both human and animal, plants. Everything needs phosphorus. It's a required nutrient for life, through compounds like phosphates are a component of DNA and RNA, adenosine triphosphate. So, you don't want a phosphorus concentration of zero, even though we've had a lot of lake homeowners associations say, we want zero phosphorus in our lake. And it's kind of like they don't understand that means zero fish. That means zero anything. So, there's needs to be a balance struck there, which we're all still trying to figure out what that balance is. But in 1992, a phosphate detergent ban went into place in South Carolina. So laundry detergents could no longer contain phosphates. And so you can see it had a pretty big impact on the concentration of phosphorus in our rivers and streams. In 1994, there was a voluntary nationwide ban, but in 1992, it went into effect in South Carolina and it was required. It also went into effect in North Carolina at the same time, because we get a lot of our water coming out of North Carolina. That was one of those benefits of states kind of working together and coordinating their activities. In 2012, Nikki Haley signed into law a measure banning the sale and use and distribution of dishwashing detergent with concentrations of phosphorus greater than 0.5%. So, again, we were kind of taking some strong steps to try to make a difference. So, as was stated earlier, I've sort of been in charge of our ambient surface water monitoring program since 1985. Back in the 50s and 60s, where things were monitored was focused in primarily on wastewater discharges of some sort. In 1992, I redesigned the monitoring program. We were being pushed by EPA. We had a backlog of permits that had expired and needed to be reissued. So we came up with a way to address that. And so it was a redesign of our monitoring program and our permitting activities so that we were more in sync with one another. We went from a process where a permit was issued and it was good for 5 years and it expired after 5 years and was up for renewal. But if the water quality standards changed, it might impact that one permit, but its next door neighbor that had a permit that was good for another 3 or 4 years didn't get those new limits put on their permit at the same time. So it was a hit or miss as to when you were going to get control and consistent water quality within a watershed. So that was part of the redesign in '92, was to go to where we were focusing on river basins, and we got all the permits timed and in line. So all the permits within a river basin would expire and be renewed at the same time so that adjustments could be made to all the permits at the same time. In 2001, I added a state scale statistical survey component to our monitoring. You know, it's like an exit poll on an election result. It's how do you take a survey of a large area and a large resource with a limited amount of resources available to do that monitoring. So how can you make statements about the overall condition of all the streams in the state? You can't possibly sample every stream in the state. So this was a way of being able to extrapolate by sampling subsets. In 2009, budget cuts forced another redesign. It really cut back our monitoring, and we had to go from monthly sampling to only sampling every other month. So that had a huge impact on our monitoring resources. And then in 2015, additional funding came back from the legislature to restore us to that monthly sampling frequency. And it wasn't DHEC that got them to give us more money. It was actually some of the river keepers in the state, American Rivers, and some other conservation groups in the state actually went in front of the committee that was the legislative committee that was determining budgets for the different state agencies. And they went in and they had all of their information together. I don't know where they got it, on how much we had lost in our monitoring. What was the reduction in the number of sites, the amount of data points that we were getting for making permitting decisions and every other water quality decision that we were making. So it wasn't DHEC that got that accomplished. It was the other people in the state that were interested in water quality and better management of water quality. Our surface water monitoring program has been recognized by EPA as an outstanding program. And they recommend to other states to look to what we do. And in fact, I just got an email through our EPA Region 4 monitoring coordinator that New Mexico is looking to have somebody help them redesign their monitoring program. And EPA sent them to me to try to see what we could do to help them with their monitoring design. And part of the reason we got this recognition from EPA is some of the old DHEC employees, our old DHEC bosses, Russ Shearer, Alton Boozer, Sally Knowles, they were all upper level management in the Bureau of Water back in the good old days that encouraged me to go give presentations wherever possible, participate in as many EPA and other national work groups as possible, to get out there and make sure everybody knew what South Carolina was doing. And because of that exposure, I was asked to serve on the core group for NOAA's 1999 National Estuarine Eutrophication Assessment, the effects of nutrient enrichment on the nation's estuaries. As was mentioned with Dr. Bob Vandola from DNR, we founded the South Carolina Estuarine and Coastal Assessment Program in 1999. Since EPA started their National Aquatic Resource Survey Program, and that is a nationwide statistical survey design. I've served on the steering committee for the National Rivers and Streams Assessment, the National Lakes Assessment, and the National Coastal Condition Assessments. We were doing our state scale survey monitoring where we were sampling monthly at all of our sites. And so when EPA went on the national scale with that, they wanted us at the table to let them hear from our experience what we did. And since 2009, I've represented the 8 EPA Region 4 states on the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. And I was invited to join that group by the EPA co-chair back in 2009. Some of the big projects and studies that we have done, we had been using fecal coliform bacteria as our bacteria indicator for years and years. And EPA really didn't think it was appropriate any longer. They'd done some new studies and found that E. coli or Enterococcus were actually better indicators of impacts to human health. So in 2007, EPA started to revise the national bacteria criteria. And it became clear that the way we were doing things with fecal coliform standards wouldn't meet those new requirements. So in January of 2009, we started sampling weekly at 73 monitoring sites around the state that were selected for the amount of development, the types of development, the types of land cover, so that we could collect our own data to kind of take a look at what sort of numbers would maybe be appropriate for South Carolina. At the same time, EPA was doing their own thing, and I was in communication with them a lot. So I made sure we didn't do anything that wouldn't be acceptable to them in the end, because EPA has to approve our water quality standards. And if we go too far afield from what they're recommending nationwide, we can be more strict, but we can't be less strict. So I tried to make sure we stayed on course as we were doing this study. And the result was, well, we looked at, from a single sample, we were looking at E. coli, Enterococcus, and fecal coliform. So we could look at all 3 of the possible indicators and look for the relationships between them. And that resulted in us changing our water quality regs and abandoning fecal coliforms for fresh water and adopting E. coli for fresh water. So the regulation change. We had some issues with lead.
David, may I ask a question now, or shall I keep them till later?
Go ahead and ask.
Yeah, when you said you were developing them, one of the things I was curious about was, did you guys actually also look at epidemiological data? So how many people were falling sick versus, because I think that's what the epidemiological study was in like in the Great Lakes. So did you get like how many people were falling sick, or how did you look at that?
We did not.
Okay.
That's what EPA did.
Yeah.
Is they were developing and making those changes to their criteria. And we were just looking to see, they were going to come up with numbers based on that epidemiology data that they collected. we wanted to see what those numbers would look like and how they'd reflect in South Carolina. Because, as I said, we couldn't do anything less strict than what they developed. So no, we didn't. Go ahead, Dr.
I
Scott.
was just going to mention, I believe EPA came coastally at Surfside and did epi studies on the surface water there for the marine standards, did the epi.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
And just a follow-up question, I was always curious, I never found out, even though I taught the class, but I was curious about why we used enterococci in the coastal waters and E. coli in the fresh waters.
E. coli don't have much of a cellular wall,
Okay.
and you put them in salt water and they become raisins.
Okay, all right.
They don't survive in salt water, and what you're looking for, because we're looking for indicator organisms, not necessarily the ones that are the pathogens. And what you're looking for is indicators in the different environments are things that have the behavior of the pathogenic species. So that's where EPA said E. coli won't work in salt water. You could use Enterococcus in fresh water and salt water, but we were working with NPDES discharge permittees. We were working with the citizens conservation groups, and they all strongly wanted to go with E. coli because previous standard was fecal coliform, and E. coli is a subset of fecal coliforms. And so they all felt like they were comfortable with turning the focus to E. coli, and Enterococcus is a completely different animal. So that's why we ended up going that way. And for lead, in 2009, our laboratory changed their analytical procedures and reporting limits for lead. And so all of a sudden, where we'd never had any lead issues before, all of a sudden we started seeing standards issues, standards violations for lead. And the freshwater metals criteria have a component for hardness and TSS that can be used to calculate a criterion. Because TSS, you get a lot of partitioning of the metals being bound to solids. And so they're not biologically available in the stream if they're bound to substrate. And so we weren't in our program at the time measuring anything to do with TSS, suspended solids. So we were using default values for setting permit limits and for looking at the data. And so we decided that we needed to get a better handle on make sure we were calculating all of those things accurately. And so again, we did a statewide study, collected data, and started getting the TSS and hardness and data to go with each of those metal samples. And looking at that data, it again led to a change in the state regulations and how they were applied for looking at our ambient data and for setting permit limits. So again, EHEC does try to use science to make a lot of decisions. We don't always just let EPA tell us what to do. We like to see if that reflects what we see in our own data in our own state. And then I helped get Adopt a Stream off the ground. I'd been trying for several years to get DHEC interested in starting a citizen science program, a volunteer monitoring program. But, management was, we don't have staff, we don't have resources to devote to that. I met with several other volunteer monitoring programs that were taking place in the state. Susan Liebus had her volunteer monitoring program in Merle's Inlet and down in the Waccamaw River. Met with her, Rick DeVoe from Sea Grant. some folks from EPA, some folks from the Clemson Center for Watershed Excellence. And everybody kind of said, oh, that would be great, but I'm not going to do it. You know, we need money, we need staff. And so for the longest time, you know, the DHEC position was, if somebody builds it, we will come. And then we got a change in upper top of the chain management, who was talking to Upstate Forever, who was supporting some volunteer monitoring over on the western side of the state, in the Savannah River area, Aiken, Greenville. And the new director said, this is a great idea. Let's do it. So, you know, it was a political decision, and you just had to be in the right place at the right time, and we were ready to move on it. So it kicked off in July of 2017. In 2021, we added a tidal saltwaters component to the volunteer monitoring. And this year, we're working now on adding a lakes component as well. All right, pollutant du jour, or is it pollutant of the year? You know, EPA's process of trying to identify those background levels of for contaminants that had environmental impacts. DDT was one of the first things they looked at. Since '96, EPA has participated in the United Nations Environment Program Treaty, known as the Stockholm Convention, on those persistent organic pollutants. That's the big focus of that convention. DDT was used to control typhus, malaria, and other insect-borne diseases. Many insects quickly developed resistance because of some of Rachel Carlson's work in her book and pointing out the impacts it was having on birds of prey. You know, their eggshells had become so fragile that the eggs were being crushed before they could be hatched. So in 1972, EPA issued a cancellation of the use of DDT. In other words, a ban on the use of DDT in the US. PCBs are another persistent organic pollutant. It's kind of one of the original forever chemicals. In South Carolina, we still have a lot of fish consumption advisories due to PCB contamination in the tissue of fishes. Manufacturing of PCBs was banned in 1979, but being forever chemicals, they're not going anywhere. So we still have fish consumption advisories due to PCB contamination that PCBs aren't being used anymore. Mercury. You know, mercury, we have tons of fish consumption advisories around the state for mercury. And, you know, it's just an element. It's a natural component of the Earth's structure. It's part of what dirt's made out of. But different practices where mercury has been used in a variety of products or a variety of different processes has released mercury to the air. And so it's kind of a global issue. It's not something that we can control here in South Carolina because we're getting mercury whose origin is coming from China and other countries. But we happen to have some waters in the state whose characteristics, and again, you know, we talked earlier, Dr. Porter, about black water and swamps. That takes this elemental mercury, converts it to methyl mercury, which is the form that gets uptaken into the fish and up through the food chain, and it gets magnified into the higher levels in the communities. And those are the fish that people want to eat. So that's why we have fish consumption advisories, and that's probably not going to go away anytime soon. We've done a lot with air emissions from coal burning power plants. That's where, that's one of the big sources of the release of mercury to the air. So we have a lot of controls on our air emissions in South Carolina, but that's not true of neighboring countries or countries around the world. And we get this, we talk about watersheds, it's very common for us, but you talk to the air program and there are air sheds. And where are these things coming from? You can look at the air shed and see where a lot of this is coming from. Dioxin, that's a disinfection byproduct of the pulp and paper bleaching. It's another persistent organic pollutant. In South Carolina, it was really, it became an issue in the Sandpit River down in Georgetown because of the international paper industry down there. Dioxin is not produced or used commercially in the US, but it can occur naturally from the combustion of wood, coal, or oil, and through the disinfection of pulp and paper byproducts. That chlorination of those compounds creates dioxin, which again is carcinogenic. But that has come largely under control, at least in South Carolina. Of course, there was the hysteria back in the, when was that? 90s? It was a big deal, and it was a real deal in some places. And North Carolina was one of the hot spots where fishermen were getting sick. People were finding it, and it turns out, it's got a really complicated life cycle. I don't know how many different forms there are in its life cycle, more than a half a dozen different stages it goes through, and it can become encysted and survive in the sediment until conditions are right for it to be released. So we had a grant, we did a lot of sampling in South Carolina, and it was found in very few places in our state. And the grant ran out, but it really has not really caused much of an issue in South Carolina. The popcorn shrimp. I gotta find my notes on this one. Well, in 1992, a fisherman who had been fishing recreationally for shrimp around the Ashley River, he was just casting his net, collecting some shrimp, put them in his cooler, and as he was heading home, as he was crossing the Cooper River Bridge, he noticed smoke coming from the back of his truck and his coolers. And the shrimp had been up in the marsh and had been, feeding on the sediment. They're sometimes referred to as the cockroaches of the ocean. They'll eat anything. But when you're driving into Charleston, there's Ashley Phosphate Road, and it got its name because there were a lot of phosphate fertilizer industries there where they were producing phosphates for fertilizer. And a lot of the tailings were washing off back into the marsh area, but they were also mining phosphorus right out of the sediments of the Ashley River. It was that common and that concentrated that was a big industry down in the Charleston area back from the 1800s until the early 1900s. And so there was a lot of phosphorus contamination. So I like to call those things popcorn shrimp. That's an exaggeration, but I think about, let's market them as self-cooking shrimp. Go to the store, look for Dave Chestnut's self-cooking shrimp. All you got to do is take them out of the package and expose them to air for a while and wait for them to cook themselves. And a lot of these pollutants du jour are the result of media attention these days. There's a lot of things that get media attention. Back in the 1870s, there wasn't a whole lot of internet activity that let people know about the phosphorus contamination down there. But now, anything that happens all of a sudden becomes a major national or worldwide attention getter. Organotins or marine anti-fouling treatment process, also in pesticides and herbicides. And we had a situation over in Lexington County where an industry that was producing organotins had an issue with their process and released a whole bunch of their process water down their drain that went to a Lexington wastewater treatment plant. And because they're pesticides, it wiped out all of the biological treatment in the plant. It contaminated all of the concrete structures so that they couldn't reopen the plant. It had to be rebuilt. And it also wiped out everything in a pond further downstream. So again, it wasn't a permitted discharge. It was an oops discharge. I talked to lead giving us some problems back in the old days, but lead is still in the news all the time related to drinking water, the Flint, Michigan situation. It's still a big issue because there's so much lead in drinking water distribution systems and in homes, in their plumbing. So lead in drinking water continues to be an issue. Harmful algal blooms, have become a big issue in recent years. We did not used to do anything with that in South Carolina, not from DHEC's perspective. We did have a person in the state that we kind of relied on if we ever had a Habs bloom, that she was our state expert that would ID things and advise us. She got a better job in another state. So that's when we kind of, I started talking to people like Dr. Porter and Dr. Scott and Dr. Pickney and USGS here in South Carolina, NOAA. And we kind of got together and said, we need to be able to respond to any of these situations that may develop. DHEC began sampling for microcystins in our lakes, and we've added microcystin monitoring to a lot of our estuaries as well, to try to give us some idea. We didn't have any data. We didn't know what background conditions were like. We didn't know what was here and what wasn't here. So at least now we're looking for it, and we're working with other partners here in the state, Dr. Ferry in the Department of Chemistry, so that if something pops up and we don't know what it is, we can share samples. We can get identification of organisms confirmed by other experts in the state. So that's, been an issue. That's been a change that's happened. PFAS and PFOA, more recent forever chemicals, they're oil and water and stain resistant. They're used in clothing and fabrics, carpeting. They're very stable in the environment, so they don't break down. They're used in a lot of situations because they reduce friction. And if you've ever had Teflon cooking pans, that's why nothing sticks to them. You've got these cancer-causing forever chemicals in the coatings on your pans. So, it's become a huge issue in the media in recent years, the last couple of years. But let's face it, whatever impact they're going to have on the environment is already there because they've been in use for 75 years. And that's a lot of what EPA's focus on things has been, is what are we using, what's out there that we need to be able to evaluate what its impacts and risks are to human health and animal life. So, that's what they have really been focused on. One of the more recent things is the Surgeon General has warned that saliva causes cancer, but only if swallowed in small amounts over a long period of time. And my source on that is George Carlin. So, be on the lookout for that. Something that changed in 2016 was a change to the Toxic Substance Control Act, Chemical Safety for the 21st Century, enacted in June of 2016. And it mandated that new chemicals, or EPA's new chemicals program, was looking for industry to do health evaluations and environmental impact evaluations on new chemicals before they went to market. So we didn't have another PFAS and PFOA situation where there were things in use that were going to be widely distributed that nobody knew what their impact was going to be. So that is the program that was developed, and some people that are more concerned about making money in industry and not restricting industry and reducing the amount of controls that are impacting their ability to make money and do new things. This has not been a very well implemented addition to the Clean Water Act. So, it's something that everybody thinks needs to be done, but it hasn't really gotten the big boost that it needs to really start being effective. So what are we going to do in the future? Well, let's make all U.S. waters fishable and swimmable by 1983. Is there going to be a new date, a new target? And as long as we keep finding things that are already out there in the environment that are having impacts to both wildlife and humans, I don't know that we can set a date. It's a moving target. As we discover more and more things that are harmful, that date has to keep moving. To have zero water pollution discharge by 1985. Is that improved? Is that achievable? Where is all that wastewater going to go? You got to put it somewhere. It's not like we're going to quit going to the bathroom. To prohibit discharge of toxic amounts of toxic pollutants. The definition of toxic pollutants changes. When you're going from things that cause fish kills to saliva that causes cancer after swallowing small amounts over a long period of time. How do you define what's a toxic amount of a toxic pollutant? And to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That's the goal, but I think our path towards that goal is changing all the time. And I don't know if we've got time for a few questions, but I don't really have to go anywhere if anybody wants to stick around.
We do have time for a few questions.
So Dave, first a question and a comment. So when you started DHEC, were you and Earl in the same office?
Yeah, Earl was
So actually, Dave, or Dr. Scott, I may have met Dave before I met you, because I met you when you first started through Earl. So that leads to my comment there. For those of us in the room here and many of the folks on Zoom, there's a glaring omission in your presentation here. And it's relative to the role that you and Brian and your office have had in the professional development of our students. And I'll bet there's not a slide on that presentation that did not include an activity that for which we had students engaged. So Dave and Brian and their office, I would guess they've supported or engaged probably 50, 60 students that Dr. Scott and I have mentored over the years. And I would love to see a tally of the impact that you all and the Bureau of Water has had on the education and training of our students, not only in the School of Public Health, but the Marine Science program, the MERM program across campus.
Maggie worked with us for a while. Caitlin Smith, we've hired on and she works for us now. Was Ronnie Martin part of, Ronnie, we've hired on. And there've been a lot of other people that have done, practicums and things with us.
So we thank you
We
all for
always
that.
try to contact Dr. Porter and Dr. Scott when we're looking for people that are looking for a project, or when we've got a project that we need some support for. It's a win-win for both of us.
Well, I was gonna say, we used to say the three Davids, David Chestnut, David Bays, and David Graves, because we would get the call from one of you three. And those were some really good times when we were all working together.
Well, and see, Brian even came from you guys, or came from USC a long time ago. And as we tell people, I trained him too well because now he's my boss.
I'm Bailey Parker with Gills Creek Watershed Association. Hi, thanks for doing this. My question goes back to 2015, when these community groups and riverkeepers were able to successfully lobby South Carolina legislators to reinstate lost funds for environmental causes. So when you say 2015, I think of the flood. So was there success maybe kicked off by the flood occurring and governments going, maybe we should do something or get involved, or was that decision actually made before October of 2015?
It was before the floods because the whole budgetary process had already begun. And it didn't hurt those groups that one of the big focal parties to that had worked at DHEC and had worked closely with me in the monitoring program. So she knew what we used to do and what had been lost. And she knew where to go to get numbers to support that. And so that was a large part of their success in that effort, was being able to come in with hard numbers that we said they're accurate, those are correct, to show how much we had lost. And there were some legislators that were completely unaware of what those budget cuts had, how they had impacted us, and the amount of monitoring and the amount of data that we were collecting. A couple of them, can't think of his name right off the top of my head, but he was just flabbergasted to find out, what that reduction was and the impact of those budget cuts, and kind of how those budget cuts got distributed through different DHEC programs. Because monitoring's, not high on people's lists, and especially when you're talking about nursing staff and health aspects of our mission, as well as the environment. And so this effort that's underway now in the legislature to maybe split DHEC back into two separate agencies and make the environment completely separate from health might give us better control over some of that money and how it's spent, because we'd have our own budget and we wouldn't have to be fighting with the health side on how that gets used. Yes.
I have a question. presentation first. Second, I see that we have different programs that monitor different toxin emerging concerns. I just thinking as a student, is any way that we can have access to the monitoring data? Because, for example, I work with bacteria, and I'm thinking more in the sweaty area. If we want to focus in a specific part of the state, if we can get like data from that monitoring programs that give us a like overall perspective for the area. For example, how many HABs events we can have in the past 10 years. If that has been identified, maybe, I don't know.
Well, HABs is one thing that we've got some data for the last 4 years or so. Emerging contaminants, there aren't any standards, so we don't know what's a bad concentration. You know, how much Pantene shampoo is bad for the environment, or what component of Pantene shampoo is bad. You know, there's not any guidance out there that tells us. USGS has a lot of data where they've looked at the occurrence of some of these emerging contaminants across the country. And I can put you in touch with Paul Bradley over at USGS here in Columbia, but he's headed up a lot of studies looking at the occurrence of emerging contaminants across the country. And so USGS has data, but again, you come back to what's it mean if you find it? How fatal is it? Over what period of time? And how much saliva do you have to swallow to get it?
I was more thinking like, we sometimes focus on only one thing, but our water bodies have different, I don't know, metals, pollutants there that can affect, in my case, the bacteria that I'm looking at, like have pH change in pH, how that can affect my video, and how many HABs events we have, how many change in pH in the environment, that kind of things, like have an idea like how many HABs.
Go to our HABs website, have a look. We've got HABs reports. We've got a website that's showing where we're sampling and what the results have been. The data is all publicly available. You just got to go look. And all of our ambient monitoring data goes into the water quality portal, which is also a public database. We're trying to get our HABs, our microcystin results into that database as well. That's something we're working on now. But all that data is available if you just know who to contact. And Emily Bors is our HABs specialist. But as I said, we're working with NOAA. So there's Steve Morton down in Charleston. Dr. Scott,
Yeah, I was just gonna say your fish kill database, which by the way, we talk about a meaningful student project. Y'all may recall, we digitized your records all the way back to the 70s. That database is there. And if you look at it from 1992, when stormwater ponds started being implemented, that really restricted the number of fish kills in surface waters to stormwater ponds. And all the HAB data is probably for the last 20 years is probably in that fish kill record between Diane Greenfield and the database y'all have. So if you are interested in that, Carlin, I think there's some real meaningful data that you can mine because the HAB events usually always have a fish kill component with it.
yes, so, you know, and once again, there is no data management group at DHEC. Every program has their own database. As I was talking to you earlier, shellfish sanitation that deals with the occurrence of Vibrio and opening and closing shellfish harvesting. I never see that data. It has nothing to do with my program. It has something to do with the environment, and maybe some of the data that we have could be related to it, but they're not looking for water quality data, and I'm not looking for Vibrio. So
My thinking is like to connect that to like databases that we probably have there. Is a way that we can see this water quality give us that number of 50 or something like that.
Well, and that's a good research project.
I'll step in real quick. Yes, there is water quality portal that he alluded to has all of our statewide monitoring program data in it back to 2000 or 1999 currently. We also have a data set that is the original storette that you saw that chart was produced from, that I have set aside that's safe and backed up and redundant, but we have access to that data as well prior to 99. My goal at some point is to have that data loaded into WQX as well, so that, which feeds into the water quality portal, apologize. So that data will all be available back, and these long-term runs and trends and assessments would be able to be done on that. One thing to note, that data that's prior to 99, you have to kind of accept as is, because we don't have the best method and QA that goes back to it. So you just have to accept that that was the best measured in QA at the time it was used. Just even back before 2010, our lab, because of FOI records and whatnot, we lose a lot of that QA. So it was valid among the method and acceptable at the time it was measured. And of course, as data gets older, we all understand that. So yes, we could get data, we could get information for you that's for that surface water of your contemporary contaminants. We do have some of the other organotins and all, but yes, we can get there.
Probably a decent
Brian, can you all hear me? It's
project.
Emily.
Calling DHEC and USGS and NOAA and getting the contact information for people, but also where is the data housed? Having one big listing of all that would probably be useful to an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
I have Emily online joining us, and she said if you have any questions about, specific questions about HABs, to contact her for the email address.
Are there any questions from the online group?
No questions there.
All right, well, I think we're out of time right now, but I think Mr. Chestnut said he had a few more minutes afterwards. So if you have any pressing questions you want to talk to him about, feel free to come up to him and after the seminar.